April 21, 1945. Dessau, Germany. 6:47 in the morning. A massive explosion tore through the pre-dawn silence. A German tank, 70 tons of steel, the most feared weapon on Earth, had its turret ripped completely off its hull and launched 40 feet into the air by a single American shell. The crew inside never had a chance to fire a second shot. The fireball rose above the ruined rooftops of Dessau, visible for 3 miles in every direction. The German tankers who witnessed it from a distance could not believe what they were seeing. Their King Tiger, a machine that had dominated every Allied tank it had ever faced, had been killed in under 20 seconds. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep bringing these untold stories to life. Say, the man behind that kill was not a decorated officer, not a graduate of West Point. Staff Sergeant Joseph Madrea was a 23-year-old kid from Louisiana who had worked as an automobile mechanic before the Army found him and handed him the keys to a tank. His gunner, Corporal John Irwin, had been a factory worker in Ohio. 2 ordinary men sitting inside a machine that had never seen combat before that morning. An experimental prototype that most American generals had never even heard of firing a gun, so powerful and so new that nobody had yet bothered to write a proper field manual for it. Wow! In the next 60 minutes, we are going to tell you exactly how that shot was fired, why it almost never happened, and what it truly meant for the men who bled and died in American tanks for the 3 years before that morning in Dessau. Because the story of the M26 Pershing is not a triumphant story. It is a story about what happens when the wrong people make decisions that the right people have to die for. It is a story about bureaucratic cowardice measured in American lives. And it is a story about one impossible tank, one impossible gun, and one April morning when American engineering finally answered a question that had haunted every Sherman crew since Normandy. Ghetto! But to understand why that explosion above the rooftops of Dessau mattered so much, you first need to understand the nightmare that American tankers had been living inside for nearly 2 years before it happened. Imagine you are handed a pistol and told to go fight a man who is carrying a rifle. He can shoot you from 200 yards. You cannot hit him past 50. Your commanders assure you the pistol is adequate. They have reports. They have studies. They have meetings in Washington where men in clean uniforms discuss penetration statistics. You are in a field in Normandy watching your friends burn alive inside their tanks, and you know with absolute bone-deep certainty that the men writing those reports have never sat inside an M4 Sherman, while an 88mm shell punched through the armor like it was cardboard. That was the reality of American armored warfare from June 1944 through the spring of 1945. The Tiger II. The King. Tiger weighed 69 metric tons. Its frontal armor was 150 millimeters of hardened steel plate, angled at 50 degrees. That angle was not accidental. German engineers understood that a sloped plate forces an incoming shell to travel through more effective thickness than a flat measurement suggests. 150 millimeters at 50 degrees behaves like over 200 millimeters of vertical plate. Against that protection, the standard American 76mm gun, firing its best ammunition, could penetrate perhaps 109 millimeters at 1,000 meters range. The numbers did not come close to matching. The King Tiger's main gun was the 88mm KWK-43, one of the most lethal weapons ever mounted on a tank. Its barrel was over 6 meters long. It fired its armor-piercing round at 1,130 meters per second, faster than the crack of the sound it made when it left the barrel. At 1,000 meters, it penetrated 193 millimeters of armor. At 2,000 meters over a mile away, it still penetrated 132 millimeters. This meant a King Tiger could kill any Allied tank in existence from distances so great that Allied crews sometimes did not realize they were under fire until the first shell had already hit. American tank crews learned the mathematics of this problem not from manuals, but from watching their friends die. They learned that engaging a King Tiger from the front was not bravery. It was suicide. They learned that the only tactics worth attempting were flanking maneuvers to reach the 80mm side armor, or calling in artillery, or waiting for air support, or using sheer, overwhelming numbers to swarm a single German tank from multiple directions, while accepting that some of those tanks and the men inside them would not survive the attempt. They did these things not because doctrine told them to. They did them because they had no other choice. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, the King Tiger had appeared in numbers that could no longer be explained away by American commanders. Tankers submitted after-action reports. Commanders forwarded complaints. Intelligence officers compiled penetration data. The evidence was overwhelming and had been overwhelming for 18 months. The American Army's standard tank could not defeat the best German tank in frontal combat. Period. Full stop. And the extraordinary thing, the maddening, enraging, almost incomprehensible thing, is that this problem had been identified before the war even reached France. Back in the summer of 1942, American engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground were already testing prototypes of a heavier tank. They called it the T-20 series. They tried different guns, different hulls, different suspension systems. By 1943, the T-26 design had emerged heavier armor, a 90mm gun, a genuine heavy tank that might actually be able to fight German armor on something approaching equal terms. The man who killed this program before it could save American lives was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, Commanding General of Army Ground Forces. McNair was brilliant, decorated, and completely, fatally wrong about tanks. He believed sincerely and passionately believed that tanks should not fight other tanks. That was what tank destroyers were for. Tanks should support infantry. Tanks should exploit breakthroughs. Tanks should be fast and numerous, not heavy and powerful. McNair wrote memoranda. McNair attended meetings. McNair used his considerable institutional authority to slow-walk heavy tank development at every turn. As late as the autumn of 1943, after American soldiers had already faced Tiger tanks in Tunisia and in Italy, McNair was writing letters arguing that the 76mm gun would prove adequate against German armor. He was writing those letters from an office in Washington. The men who could have told him exactly how wrong he was were burning to death in Sherman tanks in Italy. This was the problem. Not a technical problem. Not an engineering problem. A human problem. A problem of institutional pride and doctrinal stubbornness, and the catastrophic distance between men who make decisions and men who live or die because of them. The Sherman M4 had been a genuinely fine tank for its time. When it entered production in 1942, it was reliable, fast, easy to maintain, and carried a gun that was adequate for the tanks it was expected to fight. But the Germans did not stop building better tanks. The Panther arrived in 1943, a medium tank with an 80mm sloped glacis plate and a gun that could kill a Sherman from over 2,000 meters. Then the Tiger II in 1944, with its impenetrable frontal armor and its devastating 88mm cannon. The Sherman had not changed in any meaningful way. The enemy it faced had become exponentially more dangerous. On July 2, 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day, field reports describing the 76mm gun's failure to penetrate Panther frontal armor reached General Dwight Eisenhower. His reaction was not diplomatic. Witnesses described the Supreme Allied commander furious, demanding to know why a gun his ordnance officers had personally guaranteed would handle anything the Germans could field was failing against German medium tanks. Not even their heavy tanks. Their medium tanks at standard combat ranges. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered 76mm Shermans shipped from Britain to the front. On July 25th, 102 of these improved tanks made their combat debut during Operation Cobra, and the crews who drove them into battle quickly discovered what the crews of 75mm Shermans already knew. Improved was not the same as adequate. Against a Panther's glacis, the 76mm was better. Against a King Tiger's glacis, it was still essentially useless. McNair was present for Operation Cobra that same day, observing the operation from a forward position. American bombers, flying in support of the ground attack, accidentally struck his position. He was killed instantly. He was the most senior American officer killed in the European theater. His death removed the single most powerful institutional obstacle to the Pershing program. Within 4 months, the T-26E3 was approved for production. The authorization that might have come in 1942 or 1943, that could have put heavy tanks into Normandy in June 1944, finally arrived in November 1944, 6 months after the Normandy landings, 17 months after the first Tiger tanks had appeared in Italy. The number of Sherman crews who had died in that gap is not a statistic that American ordnance officials were eager to calculate. In January 1945, 20 T-26E3 tanks arrived in Belgium aboard ships as part of what the Army called the Zebra mission. 20 tanks for an entire theater of war. They went to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions for combat evaluation. The crews who received them understood they were driving something genuinely different. The Pershing weighed 46 tons against the Sherman's 33. Its frontal hull armor was 102 millimeters, its turret front, 114 millimeters. The 90 millimeter M3 gun could penetrate approximately 195 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards with its best ammunition. On paper, this was a different category of weapon. On paper, the Pershing could finally threaten the King Tiger's turret and gun mantlet at combat ranges. But one of those first Pershings, nicknamed Fireball, was ambushed at Elsdorf on February 26th by a concealed Tiger I. The German tank fired 3 shots from 100 yards. The first round punched through the turret mantlet and killed the gunner and loader. The second detonated the chambered round in the gun barrel. The Pershing, this brand new tank, this answer to years of American tankers dying in Shermans, was knocked out at 100 yards. The improved armor had not saved the crew. What saved the surviving crewmen was that the attacking Tiger became entangled in rubble, trying to withdraw, and was abandoned. This was the truth of the Pershing's arrival in Europe. Not a triumph, not a war-winning superweapon. A better tank, genuinely meaningfully better, that arrived in quantities too small, too late, to change what was happening to the tens of thousands of Sherman crews still fighting through Germany with guns and armor that everyone, including their commanders, knew were insufficient. And yet there was one more development. One further step that American engineers had taken in January 1945 in a workshop at Wellman Engineering Company, building something that nobody in the Army had officially approved, something that pushed the laws of tank gun physics far beyond anything the Pershing standard armament could achieve. They took a T-26E1 prototype. They pulled out the 90 millimeter M3 gun. And they installed with enormous difficulty a weapon so long that it extended 21 feet in front of the tank's hull. A gun so powerful that it fired its tungsten core projectile at 1,140 meters per second, generating penetration values of 260 millimeters at 1,000 meters. Not 109, not 132, not 195, 260 millimeters. For the first time in the entire European campaign, American engineers had built a tank gun that did not merely approach the King Tiger's performance, it exceeded it. They called the vehicle the T-26E4 Super Pershing. They built exactly one. And they shipped it to the 3rd Armored Division in mid-March 1945, where maintenance crews immediately looked at its armor protection still identical to the standard Pershings, and decided that a gun that powerful deserved a tank that could survive long enough to use it. They began cutting armor plates from destroyed German Panthers and welding them directly onto the Super Pershing's hull front and turret mantlet. Field expedient, improvised, completely unauthorized. 5 additional tons of steel bolted onto a prototype that had never been designed to carry it. Staff Sergeant Joseph Madrea took command of this unique, extraordinary, one-of-a-kind machine in April 1945. The mechanic from Louisiana who had grown up fixing engines in a small-town garage. His gunner, Corporal Irwin, from an Ohio factory floor. 2 ordinary men in an extraordinary machine rolling into a city that lay in ruins, not knowing that within days they would fire the most consequential shots of their lives. And here is what you need to understand before we tell you exactly what happened on that April morning in Dessau, The war was already won. Germany was already defeated. The outcome was not in doubt. Allied armies were converging from east and west. Berlin would fall within days. But for the men in American tanks in April 1945, that reality offered cold comfort. German soldiers were still fighting. German tanks were still killing. The mathematical problem of range and penetration and armor that had governed every tank engagement since Normandy had not resolved itself simply because the strategic situation had become obvious. On the morning of April 21st, the Super Pershing turned a corner in the rubble-choked streets of Dessau. And something was waiting for it. In Part 2, we are going to tell you exactly what happened in those 20 seconds, second by second, shot by shot, and why the identity of the tank that Corporal Irwin killed that morning has been debated by historians for 80 years. The answer is not what the legend says. The truth is stranger, more complicated, and in some ways more important than the myth. What we can tell you right now is this: the turret left the hull. It traveled 40 feet through the morning air above Dessau's broken skyline. And the two men who made that happen were a mechanic and a factory worker who had been handed the most powerful tank gun in the American arsenal and told essentially to go figure it out. Figure out they did. Last time we told you about Staff Sergeant Joseph Madrea and Corporal John Irwin, a mechanic and a factory worker, sitting inside the only Super Pershing to reach Europe. We told you about the turret that left its hull above the rooftops of Dessau on the morning of April 21st, 1945. And we left you with a question that has divided historians for 80 years. What exactly did they kill that morning? But before we answer that question, you need to understand what happened in the weeks between the Super Pershing's arrival in mid-March and that April morning. Because the battle Madrea and Irwin fought in the streets of Dessau was actually the second battle they had to win. The first battle was fought not against German armor. It was fought against American brass. And it nearly ended before a single shot was fired. Here is the number that tells you everything about that first battle. By March 1945, the United States Army had been fighting in Europe for nearly 3 years. In those 3 years, American ordnance officials had approved exactly one Super Pershing for combat deployment. 1. A single experimental prototype shipped to a theater of war containing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The men running American tank procurement had watched their tankers die in Shermans for 36 months, and their answer to the Tiger II problem was one tank. And that is when things got considerably worse. When the Super Pershing arrived at the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance compound in mid-March, Captain Belton Cooper immediately understood two things. The first was that the T-15E1 gun was extraordinary, a weapon that genuinely outperformed anything Germany had fielded. The second was that the tank surrounding that gun was going to get the crew killed before they could use it. The Super Pershing's armor protection was identical to the standard Pershing. Against an 88mm KWK-43 at combat range, that armor was not adequate. Cooper brought his concerns to Colonel John Wellborn, commanding the 33rd Armored Regiment. He laid out the numbers clearly. The Super Pershing's glacis was 102mm. The King Tiger's gun penetrated 193mm at 1,000 meters. The math was not ambiguous. Wellborn looked at the figures. Then he looked at Cooper. "What do you need?" he asked. "Permission to modify the armor, and whatever German plate my crews can find," Cooper said. What followed was the kind of institutional resistance that had defined American tank development since 1942, compressed into a matter of days. Requests went up the chain. Responses came back cautious hedging, bureaucratically non-committal. Modified. How authorized by whom? What are the weight implications for the drivetrain? Who assumes liability for an unauthorized field modification to an experimental prototype? Cooper did not wait for final authorization. He told his maintenance crews to start cutting. They salvaged 38mm steel plates from a destroyed German half-track. They cut an 80mm plate from the upper glacis of an abandoned Panther. They welded these directly onto the Super Pershing's hull front and turret mantlet, working through the night in a forward maintenance compound with German artillery audible in the distance. The welding was rough. The fit was imperfect. An ordnance inspector from Army headquarters who visited the compound 2 days later stared at the vehicle for a long moment. "That is not a regulation modification," he said. "No, sir," Cooper agreed. "It is not. If that tank breaks down under the extra weight, Division is going to want to know who authorized this." Cooper looked at him steadily. "Then Division can come ask me." "Yes, sir." The inspector wrote something in his notebook and left. The modification stayed. 5 additional tons of German steel now sat on an American prototype held in place by field welds from tired mechanics working by lamplight. Nobody above the divisional level had formally approved any of it. Nobody below the divisional level cared. But there was a second problem, and this one could not be solved with a cutting torch. The T-15E1 gun's ammunition was unlike anything in the American supply chain. The armor-piercing rounds were 50 inches long, nearly as tall as the men who had to load them. Moving one required 2 hands and considerable upper body strength. The propellant charge was separate from the projectile, meaning the loader had to handle 2 massive components under combat conditions, in a moving tank, potentially under fire, with German shells impacting the hull. The standard American heavy tank loader could manage perhaps 4 aimed shots per minute in ideal conditions. With T-15E1 ammunition, that rate dropped closer to 2 aimed shots per minute, against a King Tiger that could fire 3. When Madraya first walked around his new tank and was briefed on the ammunition situation, his reaction was characteristically direct. "So if we miss," he said, "they get to shoot at us one more time before we can shoot back." "That's correct, Sergeant." The ordnance officer briefing him confirmed. Madraya looked at Irwin. Irwin shrugged. "Better not miss," Irwin said. And they spent the following days dry loading, picking up the training rounds, going through the motions, training muscle memory, until Irwin could traverse, identify, and call his shot in under 8 seconds, and the loader could have a second round ready in under 30. It was not a perfect solution to a physics problem, but it was the best available answer, which in April 1945 was the only category of answer on offer. On April 4th, the Super Pershing moved with the 33rd Armored Regiment's spearhead toward Nordhausen. The division's advance took them through the collapsing architecture of German resistance, roadblocks, ambushes, rearguard positions from units that were understrength, undersupplied, and fighting with the particular desperate ferocity of men who know they have already lost. The column was moving through wooded terrain when a German position on a hillside opened fire. The Super Pershing's position in the column gave it a clear angle. Irwin traversed. He identified the target, something large, armored hull down on the forward slope at approximately 1,500 yards. He called his shot. He fired. The explosion on that hillside was not a normal tank gun hit. Witnesses described a column of sparks and debris shooting 50 feet into the air, followed by a secondary detonation that sent fragments flying for 200 yards in every direction. Whatever Irwin had hit the T-15E1 gun had not simply penetrated it, it had demolished it. At 1,500 yards, the range at which Sherman crews prayed they were not being observed by German tanks, not engaging them. The crew sat in silence for a moment after the reverberations died. Then the radio crackled. Regiment wanted to know what had just happened. Cooper's voice came on moments later, asking for a damage assessment. "Target destroyed," Irwin reported. "1 shot." Later analysis suggested the destroyed vehicle was likely a Panther or a self-propelled gun, not a King Tiger. The full King Tiger test was still coming. But the engagement had demonstrated one thing beyond argument. The T-15E1 gun delivered its penetration figures in actual combat, not just on Aberdeen's testing range. 260 millimeters of penetration potential firing at a target 1,500 yards away had produced a result that no standard American tank gun could have replicated. Wow. Word moved through the regiment quickly. Crews who had spent months in Shermans, who had developed the particular vigilance of men who know their vehicle cannot win certain fights, came to look at the Super Pershing with a different kind of attention. Not reverence. Something more cautious than that. More like the attention you give a tool that might actually do the job you've been trying to do, with inadequate tools, for a very long time. Shortly after Nordhausen, Madraya took formal command of the Super Pershing, and the 33rd Armored pushed deeper into Germany. The race to the Elbe River was accelerating. Resistance varied unpredictably, some German units surrendering on contact, others fighting with startling intensity from prepared positions. The Super Pershing moved with the regiment's spearhead, its extraordinary gun barrel extending so far ahead of the hull that drivers of following vehicles used it as a visual reference point for the column. German soldiers who encountered it often paused. 21 feet of gun barrel does not look like any standard American tank. It announced itself as something different, something outside the expected catalog of enemy weapons. Prisoners taken during this period mentioned under interrogation that the unusual tank had been reported up German command channels as a new American heavy tank type. The Germans were trying to identify it. They did not yet understand what its gun could do. They were about to find out. On April 21, 1945, the 33rd Armored entered Dessau. The city was destroyed. Weeks of Allied bombing had reduced most of the urban core to rubble fields, interrupted by skeletal building facades. The streets that remained passable were narrow corridors through debris, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards in any direction. For tanks, this was the worst possible environment. The range advantage of the T-15E1 gun meant nothing in streets where you could not see farther than the next intersection. Madraya moved the Super Pershing carefully, Irwin's eyes at the gun sight watching every shadow and void in the rubble. At 6:47 in the morning, the tank turned at an intersection, and Irwin saw it. A German tank, approximately 600 yards, partially obscured by debris. It fired first, and the round passed close enough that the crew felt the pressure wave close enough that Madraya later said he could not tell whether it had struck the ground in front of them or passed between the tracks. German range estimation in the chaotic visual environment of an urban rubble field was difficult. The German gunner had the direction, but had misjudged by meters. Irwin was already traversing. His first shot was high explosive. It struck the German tank's turret and failed to penetrate, but the impact was enough to shift the vehicle's orientation as its driver reacted, moving forward and up over a pile of rubble in front of its position. As the German tank crested the rubble pile, its belly was exposed. The belly armor on any tank, German, American, Soviet, was the thinnest armor on the vehicle. Engineering necessity. You cannot put 150 millimeters of steel on every surface without building something that cannot move. The King Tiger's belly armor was 25 millimeters. A Panzer IV's belly was 10 millimeters. Irwin fired his armor-piercing round. It struck the underside. It penetrated. The ammunition inside the hull detonated in a single catastrophic event. The turret left the hull. It traveled 40 feet through the morning air above Dessau and came to rest in the rubble 60 yards away from what remained of the vehicle below. The engagement had lasted 19 seconds from the German tank's first shot to the detonation. And here is where the legend diverges from the evidence. Every early account of that morning called the destroyed tank a King Tiger. The crew believed it. The regiment reported it. The story entered the record as the Super Pershing's definitive proof of capability, America's experimental super tank destroying Germany's most powerful armor in under 20 seconds. But German unit records for April 21, 1945, place the nearest King Tiger formation, SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, 270 miles from Dessau, engaged in defensive operations around Berlin against Soviet forces advancing from the east. A lone King Tiger, separated from its unit, operating independently in Dessau, with no fuel support and no maintenance capability, contradicts every operational norm of how German heavy tank units functioned in the war's final weeks. American after-action reports from Dessau that day record Panthers and Panzer IVs. They record no King Tiger. The most probable explanation supported by available evidence is that the tank Irwin killed was a Panzer IV. Late-war Ausf-H or J variants had angular lines and a long 75mm gun that Allied crews routinely misidentified as Tiger variants. particularly at distance, particularly in the chaos and limited visibility of urban combat. A Panzer IV cresting a rubble pile at 600 yards in pre-dawn light in a destroyed city. With an excited crew reporting what they expected to be facing, misidentification was not just possible, it was nearly inevitable. And this distinction matters. It matters because if the destroyed tank was a Panzer IV and not a King Tiger, then the Super Pershing's actual capability against Germany's heaviest armor remained untested in combat. The weapon that exceeded the Tiger II's performance on paper, that outshot every other tank gun in the European theater. That represented the answer to the problem that had killed American tank crews for 3 years. That weapon never actually fired in anger at the target, it had been built to kill. In Part 3, we are going to follow the Super Pershing through the remaining days of Dessau and ask the harder question: what did the Pershing program actually cost, measured in the men who died in Shermans while it was delayed? And what does the gap between the mythology of American technological triumph and the mathematical reality of tank combat tell us about how nations make decisions that soldiers have to die for? The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Madrea and Irwin survived it. The Super Pershing survived it. But the accounting for what might have been, for what was lost in the years between 1942 and 1945, while McNair wrote his memoranda and the committees met, and the institutional inertia ground forward, that accounting has never fully been made. Until now. Martin, we have told you about the mechanic from Louisiana and the factory worker from Ohio. We have told you about the Weld's Cooper's crew laid down by lamplight on a German steel plate. We have told you about the turret that left its hull at 6:47 on an April morning and traveled 40 feet through the air above Dessau. And we left you with the question that the mythology had been avoiding for 80 years: if the tank Irwin killed was probably a Panzer IV and not a King Tiger. What did the Super Pershing program actually prove? What did it cost? And what does the gap between the legend and the evidence tell us about how this war was actually fought and won? Now the accounting begins. By late April 1945, German intelligence had been tracking the unusual American tank for 3 weeks. Prisoners taken by the 3rd Armored Division had reported it up their command chain. The descriptions were consistent: an American tank with a gun barrel so long it extended past the hull, moving with the division's spearhead, destroying targets at ranges that normal American tanks could not achieve. German Armored Command in the sector requested photographs. They requested technical assessments. They requested urgently an identification of what caliber weapon this new American vehicle was carrying. They never got their answer. By the time the requests worked their way through what remained of German military bureaucracy in April 1945, the command structure receiving them was dissolving. Units were surrendering. Communications networks were collapsing. The officers who might have assembled a technical response to the Super Pershing threat were either dead captured or retreating toward Berlin with whatever fuel remained in their vehicles. This was the irony at the center of the Super Pershing story. The weapon that finally matched the King Tiger arrived at the precise moment when the King Tiger threat was no longer operationally coherent. German heavy tank formations in the West had been ground down by 3 years of attrition. By April 1945, SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 501 had fewer than 12 operational King Tigers. SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 502 was fighting 70 miles away in the Berlin suburbs. The German units the Super Pershing encountered in Dessau and the surrounding area were not equipped with King Tigers. They were equipped with whatever Germany had left Panthers with mechanical problems: Panzer IVs running on diluted fuel, self-propelled guns crewed by partially trained teenagers. The weapon had arrived. The enemy it was built to fight had already been defeated by other means. But the question that matters is not whether the Super Pershing arrived too late. The question is, what happened to the thousands of American tank crews who were fighting from 1942 through early 1945, while the institutional machinery of American ordnance delayed its development? That is where the real accounting lives. On April 22nd, the day after the Dessau engagement, Madrea's crew, encountered their next contact. A Panther. Hull immobilized by a previous hit, but turret fully operational, crew still fighting. As the Super Pershing rounded a corner and came into the Panther's field of fire, the German gunner fired. The round either missed or struck a non-critical surface. Accounts differ on this point. What is not disputed is what happened next. Irwin fired once. The Panther's turret did not leave its hull the way the previous tanks had, but the vehicle stopped fighting immediately, and it did not fight again. Later that same morning, 2 Panzer IVs crossed the Super Pershing's field of fire at a junction approximately 400 yards distant, moving not in prepared positions. Irwin traversed and fired at the first. It stopped. It burned. The second Panzer IV halted. The crew got out. They put their hands up. They did not attempt to fight. Think about what that means. German tank crews, men trained to fight men who had been fighting for years, men who understood that the Eastern Front offered no mercy for prisoners, looked at the Super Pershing's gun barrel and chose immediate surrender over combat. They made that calculation in seconds. Whatever they had been told or had observed about this American tank, they had concluded that engaging it was not a viable option. That reaction tells you more about the T-15E1 gun's tactical impact than any penetration table. The Super Pershing's combat record at Dessau thus reads: 1 unidentified tank destroyed by belly shot, 1 Panther destroyed, 1 Panzer, 4 destroyed, 2 Panzer, 4 crews captured without a fight. 3 weeks of combat, 5 engagements, 0 American casualties in the vehicle. Against none of those targets did the T-15E1 gun face its designed opponent. Against all of them, it performed with a decisiveness that no standard American tank gun could have replicated. Now step back from the individual engagements and look at the larger picture that was forming around the Super Pershing's brief combat career. In February 1945, when the first standard M26 Pershings entered combat with the 3rd Armored Division, something measurable changed in unit after-action reports. Sherman crews, who had been documenting the familiar pattern German armor encountered frontally withdrawal to flanking position, multiple shots required significant friendly losses, began reporting different outcomes. Pershings engaging Panthers frontally. Pershings taking hits to the turret that did not kill the crew. Pershings delivering first-round kills at ranges where Shermans had been forced to disengage. The numbers were not dramatic. There were fewer than 20 Pershings in the entire theater. Their impact on aggregate casualty figures for the campaign was statistically marginal. But the psychological impact within the units that had them was immediate and significant. Crews who had developed the particular fatalism of men who know their vehicle cannot win certain fights began approaching armored engagements differently. They were willing to hold ground they would previously have yielded. They were willing to engage targets they would previously have reported to artillery and waited. This shift in tactical confidence is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. It shows up in the language of after-action reports. It shows up in the testimony of officers describing crew behavior before and after Pershing deployment. Men fight differently when they believe their weapon is adequate to the threat they face. The Pershing made that belief possible. The Sherman against German heavy armor had made it impossible. The Sherman was not a bad tank. That point needs to be stated clearly and held carefully. Against the opponents, it was designed to fight the Panzer III, the early Panzer IV, the armored vehicles that Germany was fielding in 1941 and 1942. When the Sherman entered development, it was competitive, reliable, and logistically superb. American industry produced 49,234 Shermans during the war. German industry produced 8,586 Panthers and 489 King Tigers. The production ratio alone tells you which side won the industrial war. But the men inside those Shermans did not fight the production ratio. They fought specific German tanks on specific days in specific fields and streets and forests, and the mathematical reality of those individual engagements was brutal and consistent. The Sherman's gun could not reliably penetrate the Panther's glasses. It could not penetrate the King Tiger's glacis at any practical range. American tank crews knew this. They compensated with tactics numbers, artillery, and air support. They won. But they won while accepting a casualty rate that the Pershing program, had it been prioritized differently, might have reduced significantly. How significantly? The calculation is speculative, but not meaningless. American armored forces in Europe suffered approximately 7,000 tank losses from June 1944 through May 1945. Scholars who have studied the engagement records estimate that a meaningful fraction of those losses occurred in frontal engagements with German armor, where the outcome was determined by the American guns' inability to penetrate at combat range. If heavy Pershing-class tanks had been available in Normandy in June 1944, if McNair's institutional resistance had been overcome a year earlier, some portion of those 7,000 losses would not have occurred. The men who died in those tanks are the true cost of the delay. Not a statistic, not a line in an ordnance report. Men with names and histories and families who were put inside vehicles that everyone with access to the performance data understood were outmatched because the system that was supposed to provide them better vehicles had prioritized doctrine over evidence for 2 years. Staff Sergeant Madrea survived the war. He returned to Louisiana. He went back to fixing engines, which was what he had been doing before the Army gave him something more complicated to operate. Corporal Irwin survived. He returned to Ohio. He wrote a memoir decades later that is one of the primary sources for what actually happened in Dessau on April 21, 1945. And his account is careful and honest about the uncertainty surrounding the identity of the tank he killed that morning. Neither man became famous. Neither received the kind of recognition that the mythology surrounding their engagement might have suggested was warranted. The Super Pershing itself was brought back to the United States for technical evaluation. The T-15E1 gun was studied-assessed and ultimately not adopted for production. Its ammunition problems, the two-piece loading requirement. The tungsten supply constraints made it impractical for fielding at scale. The vehicle that had briefly been the most powerful tank in the European theater ended its career as a test subject in an ordnance laboratory. Captain Belton Cooper, the maintenance officer who had authorized the unauthorized armor modifications, wrote a memoir titled Death Traps that became one of the most widely read personal accounts of American armored warfare in Europe. In it, he described the institutional failures that had delayed heavy tank development with controlled fury. The meetings, the memoranda, the doctrinal stubbornness, the cost paid in Sherman crews while the committees deliberated. His assessment was not kind to the men who had managed American tank procurement. The M26 Pershing's post-war career validated the design's soundness even as it demonstrated how much potential had been left unrealized. The M46 patent, which addressed the Pershing's underpowered engine with a 800-horsepower Continental power plant, proved decisively superior to Soviet-supplied T-34/85 tanks during the Korean War from 1950 through 1953. In engagement after engagement, American crews in M46 achieved the kind of outcome against North Korean and Chinese armor that Sherman crews in Europe had achieved only through numerical superiority and combined arms. The gun was adequate. The armor was adequate. The performance validated every argument the Pershing's advocates had been making since 1942. The lineage ran forward. The M46 became the M47. The M47 became the M48. The M48 became the M60, which fought in Vietnam and survived in American service through Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The M60's basic architecture torsion bar suspension, cast turret long rod penetrator gun traced directly back to decisions made in the T-26 development program in 1943 and 1944. The Pershing's fundamental design was correct from the beginning. What was incorrect was the timeline. And at the end of this accounting, you arrive at the question that the mythology of Dessau was built to avoid. What exactly did the Super Pershing's combat debut prove? It proved that American industry, when finally motivated by accumulated battlefield evidence and freed from institutional obstruction, could produce a weapon competitive with the best Germany had fielded. It proved this too late for the Sherman crews who died from Normandy to the Rhine. It proved it against opponents that were not the King Tigers it had been designed to defeat. It proved it in quantities, one vehicle so small that the proof was effectively symbolic. Yeah, the symbolism mattered. That is not nothing. For the engineers who had fought for the program, for the crews who finally had a weapon they believed in, for the units that received Pershings in the war's final weeks and found that tank combat felt different. When your gun could answer the threat you faced, the symbolism mattered. But symbols are not the same as lives, and the lives that were not saved because the Pershing arrived in 1945 instead of 1943 represent the true legacy of the institutional failures this story is about. In Part 4, we will ask the final question. What did the men who made those failures ever acknowledge about what they cost? What happened to the doctrine that killed American tankers for 3 years while better weapons waited? And what does the Super Pershing story tell us about the systems that nations use to equip the people they send to fight systems that have not fundamentally changed in the 80 years since Corporal Irwin's armor-piercing round punched through a German tank's belly armor above the ruins of Dessau? The turret landed. The war ended. The accounting was never completed. Until now. We have followed this story from the beginning. From the mechanic from Louisiana and the factory worker from Ohio, sitting inside an unauthorized prototype with unauthorized armor, welded on by exhausted maintenance crews working by lamplight. From the institutional obstruction that delayed a weapon American tankers needed for 3 years. From the 19 seconds in Dessau that became legend. From the careful accounting of what that legend concealed and what it revealed. Now we come to the final question, the one that the mythology was never designed to answer. What happened to the men? What did their story mean, and why? 80 years later, does it still matter? Staff Sergeant Joseph Madrea came home to Louisiana in the summer of 1945. He was 23 years old. He had commanded the most powerful tank in the American arsenal during the final weeks of the most destructive war in human history. And when it was over, he went back to what he had been before, a young man who understood engines and knew how to fix things that were broken. There was no parade specifically for him. No ceremony marking the Super Pershing's combat record. The Army did not yet fully understand what it had sent to Dessau, and in the chaos of demobilization, with millions of men returning home simultaneously, individual stories dissolved into the aggregate. Corporal John Irwin returned to Ohio. He went back to factory work. He carried with him the memory of a German turret leaving its hull above a ruined city, and the quieter memory of 2 Panzer IV crews climbing out of their tanks with their hands raised rather than face his gun. Decades later, he wrote about those days with the careful precision of a man who had spent a long time thinking about what he had seen and done, and who understood that the distance between what actually happened and what the legend said happened was itself a kind of historical evidence. And Captain Belton Cooper remained in the Army for several years after the war, then left for civilian life. He spent decades after his retirement writing the memoir that would become Death Traps, published in 1998. The book was not gentle toward the men who had managed American tank procurement. Cooper named names. He described meetings and memoranda. He calculated with controlled fury what the delay in Pershing production had cost in Sherman crews. Death Traps became one of the most widely read personal accounts of American armored warfare in Europe, and it forced a generation of military historians to examine the institutional failures of the tank development program with a seriousness that earlier celebratory accounts had avoided. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, whose institutional resistance had done more than any other single factor to delay the Pershing program, was not alive to respond. He had been killed by American bombs during Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, the same day that 102 new 76mm Shermans made their combat debut. The inadequate improvement that might have been unnecessary had McNair's opposition not prevented the T-26 from reaching production a year earlier. History has a particular economy with irony. The Super Pershing itself was shipped back to the United States in the summer of 1945. Ordnance engineers examined the field modifications Cooper's crews had made. The German plates welded over the hull. Front the Panther glasses bolted to the gun mantlet with the mixture of professional admiration and institutional unease that unauthorized solutions to authorized problems typically generate. The vehicle was evaluated, its T-15E1 gun was tested, its data was cataloged, and then it was retired. The prototype that had briefly been the most powerful tank in any army's arsenal ended its operational life as a test subject and eventually as a museum piece. But here is what the Super Pershing's retirement did not end. It did not end the lineage of the design that had produced it. The M26 Pershing's fundamental architecture was correct. The engineers who had argued for heavy tank development since 1942 had been right about the requirements, even when they were wrong about specific solutions. The 90mm gun was adequate for most combat scenarios American forces would face after World War II. The armor protection was meaningful. The mobility once the underpowered Ford engine was replaced was sufficient. The design needed refinement, not replacement. The M46 Patton entered service in 1948 with the 800-horsepower Continental AV1790 engine that the Pershing's chassis had always deserved. When the Korean War began in June 1950 and American forces encountered Soviet-supplied T-34/85 tanks used by North Korean armored units, the M46 demonstrated the performance that Sherman crews in Europe had been denied. In engagement after engagement across the Korean peninsula, M46 crews achieved first-round kills at ranges where Sherman crews would have been forced to maneuver for flanking shots. The gun was adequate. The armor was adequate. The outcomes were different. The M46 became the M47, which served with American forces briefly before being transferred extensively to NATO allies, where it remained in frontline service in some nations through the 1970s. More than 8,500 M47s were produced serving in armies across Western Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The M47 became the M48, which fought in Vietnam with American forces, and in multiple Middle Eastern conflicts with Israeli, Jordanian, and other Allied forces. The M48 became the M60, which entered American service in 1960 and remained in frontline use through Operation Desert Storm in 1991, 46 years after the T-26E4 rolled into Dessau. 46 years. 15 nations, tens of thousands of vehicles, all of them tracing their lineage back to the design arguments that McNair had resisted that engineers had pursued, despite institutional opposition that Cooper's maintenance crews had improvised upon with German steel and American welding rods by lamplight in a forward compound in March 1945. The M1 Abrams, which replaced the M60 in American service, and which has been continuously upgraded since 1980, carries forward design principles that the Pershing program established. The emphasis on firepower first. The recognition that tank armor matters not just as protection, but as a psychological determinant of crew confidence and tactical decision-making. The understanding learned through bitter experience in Sherman turrets, that the men inside a tank fight differently when they believe their vehicle can answer the threats it faces. The Abrams is named for General Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at the Battle of Aricourt in September 1944, where American Sherman crews defeated a larger German Panther force through superior tactical skill, favorable terrain, and exceptional use of combined arm support, compensating, as American tankers had learned to compensate throughout the campaign for the technical disadvantage their vehicles carried. Abrams later served as Army Chief of Staff and was deeply involved in post-war American armor development. The tank that bears his name is the product of lessons drawn directly from the experiences his generation of tankers had in France and Germany. The lesson those tankers carried was not complicated. It was this: the men you send to fight deserve weapons adequate to the threats they face. When institutions fail to provide those weapons, when doctrine and bureaucratic inertia and personal ambition override the evidence coming back from the battlefield, the cost is paid in the specific and irreplaceable currency of human lives. That lesson was available from Tunisia in 1943. It was confirmed in Normandy in 1944. It was paid for continuously through the Bulge and across the Rhine. The Pershing program validated it. The Super Pershing embodied it. And the men who died in Sherman's waiting for it are its permanent memorial. Now for the detail that most histories of the Super Pershing omit, the one that Irwin's memoir preserves, but that rarely makes it into the accounts that focus on the legend of the Dessau engagement. After the war, when researchers and historians began examining the engagement records and cross-referencing them with German unit records, the identification of the tank Irwin killed on April 21st remained unresolved. For decades, the official account called it a King Tiger. The mythology required a King Tiger. The story of America's experimental supertank defeating Germany's most powerful armor made narrative sense as a conclusion to years of American tankers being outmatched. But in the late 1990s, as German military archives became more fully accessible to Western researchers, a more complete picture of German armored unit dispositions in April 1945 emerged. The records confirmed what the geographic analysis had already suggested. No King Tiger units were operating in the Dessau area on April 21, 1945. The nearest formation was 70 miles away and engaged with Soviet forces. What the records also confirmed was something more interesting. The German unit defending Dessau on that date included elements of a panzer training battalion, one of the ad hoc formations that Germany had been assembling in the war's final months, from partially trained crews. Repaired vehicles, pulled from maintenance depots, and whatever fuel could be scraped together from collapsing logistics networks. The vehicles available to this unit included several Panzer IV Ausf-J tanks, which were the final production variant of a design that had been in service since 1941, the Panzer IV. Ausf-J had a long 75mm gun angular turret lines, and at distance in poor visibility could be confused for larger German vehicles by Allied crews who had been trained to expect Tigers. In the rubble and pre-dawn light of Dessau on April 21st, a Panzer IV at 600 yards was exactly the kind of target that a combat-stressed crew in a new and unfamiliar tank might identify as something more formidable than it was. This does not diminish what Irwin did. A first-round hit with high explosive, followed by a precise armor-piercing shot into the exposed belly of a moving tank at 600 yards, delivered in under 20 seconds. While under fire is exceptional gunnery, regardless of what was on the other end of the shot. The crew of the destroyed vehicle was trying to kill Irwin and Madrea. They did not succeed. Irwin and Madrea did not give them a second opportunity. But it means that the T-15E1 gun, the weapon that finally exceeded the King Tiger's performance, that achieved the parity American tank crews had been denied for 3 years, never fired in anger at the opponent it was built to defeat. The most powerful gun in the American arsenal spent its entire combat career destroying targets that a standard M26 Pershing could have handled, while the King Tigers it had been designed to kill were being defeated by Soviet IS-2s 70 miles to the east. That is not a failure. It is something more complicated than failure. It is the product of timing of a weapon arriving at the precise moment when the threat it was designed to address had already been rendered operationally irrelevant by other forces and other means. The Super Pershing was ready when it was no longer needed for the specific purpose that had justified its existence. What it was needed for, what the Pershing program broadly was needed for, was the restoration of confidence in American tankers that their weapons were adequate to the task. That confidence had been damaged across 3 years of fighting with a gun that everyone from crew to commander understood was insufficient against the best German armor. The Pershing restored it. The Super Pershing, in its brief and limited combat career, extended it to its logical extreme, and the men who drove those vehicles in the war's final weeks fought with a certainty that their predecessors in Sherman's had been denied.
Sims.
From a mechanic from Louisiana and a factory worker from Ohio, sitting inside a welded-together improvisation of American engineering and German salvage, the story of the Super Pershing spans 4 years of institutional failure, 3 weeks of combat, and 80 years of legacy in every American tank that followed. Joseph Madrea and John Irwin did not win the war. The war was won by industrial capacity, by logistics, by air supremacy, by the accumulated sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of men in vehicles of every type and quality. But they proved something on the morning of April 21, 1945, that the mythology surrounding their engagement actually undersells. They proved that when American industry finally committed to building the right weapon, it could build the best weapon in the world. The tragedy is how long it took to commit. The lesson is why it must never take that long again. If you know a story like this one, a weapon that arrived too late, an engineer whose idea was rejected until the evidence became impossible to ignore, a crew that fought with inadequate tools and compensated through skill and courage, tell us in the comments. These stories exist in every conflict and every era, and they deserve to be told with the same honesty we have tried to bring to this one. Bote. The men who died in Shermans waiting for the Pershing did not die because American industry could not build better tanks. They died because the people making decisions had not yet been forced to confront the cost of making the wrong ones. That is not a lesson from 1945. That is a lesson from every institution that has ever chosen the comfort of established doctrine over the discomfort of evidence. The turret left the hull. It traveled 40 feet through the morning air. It landed in the rubble of Dessau. And somewhere in that trajectory, in those 19 seconds between a German tank's missed shot and an American gunner's answer, is everything this story is about.